Hey, church family, thanks once again for joining me for this midweek study. Tonight we're going to look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 18. I want to break this text up into three different areas. I want to look at the Apostle Paul's exhortation, and then the foundation for the exhortation, and then flowing from the exhortation, the application, because it's those three things. Exhortation, foundation, application. Let me read 12 through 18 of chapter 2 here in Philippians, and we will jump in then. So the Apostle Paul, he writes this: "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am being poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." So in these verses, the Apostle Paul, he's really going to draw from a lot of Old Testament references, and so I'll point those out as we go through here. I would just encourage you, as you get more time, just go read those these Old Testament references in their fuller context, just to marinate in and sit in and grasp a deeper understanding of what the Apostle Paul is calling this church at Philippi to. And by way of this church of Philippi, you and me as well. And so before he references the Old Testament, he's going to connect what he said in this exhortation, foundation, application, back to what he's already written them. And you see that in the first word of chapter 2, verse 12, therefore, right? Therefore, my beloved, right? And so you've probably heard, anytime you see the word therefore, you should ask the question, what is therefore? And so what is therefore? Well, the Apostle Paul, he's referencing back to what we've talked about over the past umpteen weeks in this book. And specifically, he's referencing what he's just said, that he wants their manner of life to be worthy of the gospel of Christ, and they were to do that in two ways: by being unified and immovable, and to do that they were to walk humbly with one another, drawing on the humility of Christ, right? Who is seen as Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, right? He had a royal robe, but not counting that equality a thing to be grasped, he humbled himself by taking the form of a servant, right? He was born in the likeness of men, so he took off his royal robe and he wrapped a servant's towel around his waist, and he served this church at Philippi, and he served you and me, but by going to his death, even death on the cross, right? That he died for us, that he was treated as a rebel for rebels. And in that, God exalted him and gave him the name above all names. He is now Lord of lords and King of kings. And so therefore, in light of all that, hey, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. So we need to pause here, because here's this first reference to the Old Testament, and it's coming from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 31. And so in the context of Deuteronomy is this farewell address, this final sermon of Moses, who, if you remember, Moses was the man that God raised up to lead God's people out of slavery, from a tyrannical king, out of service to that tyrannical king, into the service or slavery to a good, loving King Yahweh. And so God uses this man Moses to bring about salvation for his people. And so Moses is writing this final sermon to these Israelites that have been saved. And he says this in verse 27 of chapter 31. He says, "For I know how rebellious and stubborn you are. Behold, even today, while I am yet alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord. How much more after my death?" And so in chapter 31, Moses, he is handing off leadership to Joshua, and he's saying, look, you have been disobedient in my presence. Are you going to continue in your disobedience when I die in my absence? And so you see in the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians, my beloved, you have always obeyed, right? You're not like the Israelites after they were saved, right? You have walked in obedience to your Lord. So now, not only as in my presence, but also in my absence, right? It's this encouragement to continue in obedience. He's telling them to be presently obedient, and he's basing that on their past obedience. And so he's contrasting the people of Israel, how they acted after their salvation, in this Philippian church, how they've walked after their salvation. And now he gives this exhortation: work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Okay, notice what the Apostle Paul, he doesn't write in that verse. He doesn't say work for your salvation. No, but rather work out your salvation. Right? There is a clear distinction and difference. Right? If he would have said work for your salvation, it would make no sense in light of the context of what he's already said. Right? That Jesus purchased for them salvation. He's made them saints. Okay, they are partakers of grace with the Apostle Paul. Okay? They've experienced grace. Okay? And so work out your salvation. What the Apostle Paul is saying is he's just reiterating what we've already talked about. He's reiterating what he said in verse 27 of chapter 1. Right? Let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. Right? We've just said it this way: let your hands evidence your heart. Okay? And so he's just reiterating that. Right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Okay? So in the Old Testament, the people of God, in the first Exodus, as Moses led them out, that Exodus and salvation was external to them. Okay, and as it was external to them, what you find in chapter 15 of Exodus, after they've been delivered, after they've experienced that salvation, who was it that trembled? Okay, it was actually the nations. You can go read verse 16 of chapter 15. It was the nations who trembled. In fact, I'll just read that here. It says in Exodus 15, verse 16, the people of God are worshiping. They're responding to their salvation in song, and it says, terror and dread, fear and trembling fell upon them because of your great arm, because they are still as stone. Right? That in this external Exodus, in this external salvation, fear and trembling fell upon the nations. But here for the Philippians, you get this new Exodus, this second Exodus that takes place, and the Apostle Paul says, work out your salvation in fear and trembling. Right? Let your salvation be seen for others in your awe, in your reverence, in your fear of God. Okay? And I say that because this is what he says in verse 13. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Right? Let the nations see that I am Yahweh who's brought about a new Exodus. While the first Exodus was external, the second one is internal. Right? While the first Exodus had to deal with their external realities, the second Exodus that Jesus brought about has to deal with the heart. Okay, and in so doing, right, Jesus goes to the root of the problem, right? The root of the brokenness in the world, broken hearts, right? And after the first Exodus, God brings about this covenant, right? This covenant with the people of God, and now there was this promise of a new covenant, and you see this in Jeremiah 32. So here's once again another reference to the Old Testament, and this is what Jeremiah promises. God promises through this prophet Jeremiah in chapter 32, verse 38. Okay, he says, "And they shall be my people, and I will be their God, and I will give them one heart and one way." Right? That they will be united. What has the Apostle Paul talked about in this book or this letter to the Philippian church? Be united. Right? Let your manner of life be evidenced by your immovable faith and your unity with one another. And in Jeremiah, God says, look, I will be their God. They will be my people. I will give them one heart in one way. They will be united in how they walk, that they may what? Fear me forever, for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make them an everlasting covenant, that I will not turn away from doing good to them, and I will put the fear of me in their hearts, that they may not turn from me. I will rejoice in doing them good, and I will plant them in a land of faithfulness with all my heart and all my soul. Here's this promise from God in the Old Testament that he was going to make a people. He would be their God. He would make them united. And how he was going to do it was by giving them a new heart that would fear them. And so what does the Apostle Paul say? He says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Why? Because you've been given a new heart. Why? For it is God who works in you. It is God who has brought your broken heart, given you a new heart, this new exodus that has come about. Jesus has paid for your sin. Right? He is giving you a new heart, not one of stone, but one of flesh. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. See, one author wrote this: Christians work out that which God has already worked in us. Right? Christians work out that which God has already worked in us. Right? In the same way that John wrote in 1 John, we love because God first has loved. And we evidence our beliefs, this exodus that's taken place internally, because God has worked internally to bring it about externally. Right? It is God who works in us, both to will, to give new pleasures, to give new desires, okay, to work for his good pleasure. It's God who works in, both to will and to work. Right? This is what the Apostle Paul is drawing from. You are a people of the new covenant. You've been given a new heart. Be united with one another. Walk in humility. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit. Right? But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Right? Look to the interests of others before yourself. Right? Look to Jesus, who humbled himself for you, who purchased for you a salvation, not externally, but internally. He took care of the root of the problem of the world, the heart. Right? He's given us new hearts to love one another, right? To love God and to love others. And then he says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. And so this exhortation that he says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, the foundation, because God's given you a new heart. And now it comes this this application: do all things without grumbling or disputing. Right? In the Old Testament, the people of God, after they were delivered, what did they do? They grumbled. And the Apostle Paul says, don't be like them. You have a new heart. Right? Don't grumble or dispute. Right? Be blameless and innocent, children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. And so, in Deuteronomy, Moses had referenced. He had referenced what I pointed out earlier. Sorry, he had told them, right, you've been disobedient. Are you going to continue your obedience? And then in chapter 32, so a chapter later, Moses, he says this, and I think that this is important as we look at this application. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, he says, start in verse 4, the rock, his work is perfect, right? God, Yahweh, his work is perfect, for all his ways are just, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. The people of Israel, the Israelites, they have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. Why? They are a crooked and twisted generation. And so in this application, the Apostle Paul, he says, you, Philippian church, you are children of God, right? Because of what Jesus has done, his death and resurrection, you have been adopted. You are children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Right? Where Moses said the Israelites who rebelled against God by their disobedience, they are the twisted and crooked generation. The Apostle Paul says, this church, under this new covenant, you are living in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. And so what are they to do? They are to shine as lights in the world. You see, here's this beautiful reality and thing to think about for us. When is the stars the brightest? Against the darkness of a black sky. Right? In the darkness of a twisted and corrupt generation, the church is to shine brightly. Right? And we are to evidence our Creator. We are to glorify our Father in heaven. Right? And we do so by being united with one another. See, how we evidence our salvation, this internal exodus that took place, where we've been given new hearts, how we are to evidence our hearts through our hands is by being united with one another. You see, as we walk in unity with one another, we're actually showing that we are in unity with our God, that Jesus has purchased a way for us to be in relationship, in perfect union with Christ, right? That he's paid for our sin and he's given us new life. And so in the same way, we are to be lights shining in the world that is a crooked and twisted generation. And how, verse 16, by holding fast to the word of life. You see, Moses, who wrote Deuteronomy that we've referenced, right? He brought a word as well, but he brought a word of law. The book of Hebrews would tell us that Jesus is the better Moses. And what did Jesus bring? He brought a word of life, the gospel, the good news for you and me. And so how do we shine as lights? We hold fast to the gospel, right, church? And so this is our calling, to walk in unity with one another by working out our salvation with fear and trembling, knowing that it is God who has given us new hearts, and then we apply it by shining brightly to a broken and dark world. This is the three things: the exhortation, the application, or the exhortation, the foundation, and the application for us. I hope that you guys are doing well this week. Let me know if there's any way that I can serve you. Love you guys more than you know. Talk to you later.